So the past 4 weeks, we've covered what Jesus did. So this is the fourth week. The last 3 weeks, we covered what Jesus had done when he had different challenges. In Mark's gospel, it says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Jesus could have went anywhere and prayed, scholars noted, but he chose to make being alone with God a priority. You see, Luke describes when Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him, chose 12 of them whom he would designate as apostles. See, this time alone gave Jesus this clarity that he needed. So if you're in search of clarity, you want things to become clearer on the next step for your life, do what Jesus did. He spent time away with the Father seeking this clarity. Upon hearing John the Baptist was beheaded, Jesus left in a boat to a remote, desolate area to be alone. This time away was a healing process, I think, for Jesus, as he had heard about his cousin John the Baptist tragically being beheaded, which leads us tonight to this final sermon for this airplane mode. Next week, we start a 6-week series on looking at these meals that Jesus had with people. Sinners and saints, what happened at these meals? Why did he have these meals? And I think it's kind of fitting as we lead into Thanksgiving, because we're going to have some big meals, and I think all that's going to be a lot of fun. But follow along with me as we read Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through 17. So, for I would have you know, this is Paul speaking, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were the apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So you see here the Apostle Paul, upon receiving his call for discipleship and for ministry, this huge transition in his life is getting ready to take place. He travels to Arabia, where scholars say he found his new identity in Christ. You see, Galatians begins with a rather long autobiography, concluding with Paul's description of his conversion and his call to preach. Rather than going to Jerusalem, he writes that he went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Why did he leave? Why did he go to Arabia? Many have explained Paul's absence as his first missionary trip. He was gone away to do something. Scholar N.T. Wright says there's no textual evidence to support that besides your own made-up theory, so that doesn't make any sense. He said, instead, I think you should look at this trip being a time apart to confirm his calling for himself and in the eyes of his tradition. So Paul was pulling away. He had been this zealous Judaizer who had persecuted the church. He met Jesus on this road to Damascus, completely had his life completely changed, and then he took this time to pull away, to confirm his calling, to kind of fix his eyes on what God had for him. I don't want you to miss this. His trip is a model for how we might seek time apart in the midst of a significant personal change or asking for clarity in life. Do any of you guys have significant change ahead of you? Are you guys seeking clarity for an answer? Perhaps, God, give me some clarity on this next step in my life, in my marriage, with my children, in my job, with my health. We have these difficult things that we're faced with, and often what do we do first? We do what Paul said he didn't do. We go talk to other people about it. Paul said he didn't talk to nobody. He didn't go and talk to the leaders of the church at that time because I think they would have been afraid for their life because he had been arresting everybody. He pulled away. He went away. Doesn't say what he did. I'm going to give you some speculation on what scholars think that he did, but he pulled away for this time to clarify, to get direction, to really kind of firm up his steps as he made this next decision as he pursued the Lord. Scholar N.T. Wright suggests the key to uncovering the reason for Paul's trip to Arabia comes out of a close reading of the verses and listening to the echoes from Elijah's story. The prophet Elijah, like Paul, is described as a zealous man. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah finds himself on the run from Jezebel, ending his journey on Horeb, the Mount of God, where Moses first delivered the Ten Commandments from God to the people. Since these events elsewhere are described as taking place on Mount Sinai, the two names have long been considered to be described as the same place. Who else had encounters on mountains? Moses did. Jesus did. Who else had these kind of wilderness experiences where they were kind of out by themselves? David, we just read from Psalm 63, did. And so you see a pattern. What scholar N.T. Wright is saying, you see a pattern in the lives of God's men and what they did. And they went away, they spent time out, and in that they connected with God. In each of these examples, you see the Holy Spirit ministering to these men. You see, Paul accounts of these events immediately following his conversion echo the same narrative. Paul was zealous. Paul travels to Damascus. Is confirming his calling. He's able to tell of his experience to those who inevitably question his sincerity, because you got to believe that everybody had saw him as this persecutor, this kind of Christian hunter. And then he shows up and says, I met Jesus, and he told me that I'm supposed to spread the word. You can imagine that conversation, right? If you go back and picture 1938, 39, 40, 41, Jews in Germany being hunted by the Germans, you can envision a Nazi soldier coming to the Jews and say, hey, I'm here to help you. They would go, yeah, no thanks, right? And so kind of picture that in your mind. But you can't ignore these parallels in this kind of wilderness, mountainous experience as these men, as I'll tell you, don't miss this fresh off his Mount Sinai experience. So Paul had went away to have this experience with God. Paul acquires the authority to be the person God has called him to be. So this then is why he went to Arabia, to hand in his former commission, N.T. Wright says, and to acquire a new one, because he had a commission, right? He was this zealot Judaizer chasing and hunting Christians, and then he met Jesus and he was given this new commission. And I think many of us have the two sides of that life too, right? Maybe we weren't as bad as Paul was in our eyes, but sin is sin. And so we have this former way, and now we have this new way. And I submit to you tonight that the example given to us by Paul, the example given to us by Jesus, by Elijah, is these examples of these men who pulled away for this time of isolation and solitude, to spend time with God, to hear from God, to be ministered to God. And in Elijah's story, he was ministered to by angels in this kind of, as he was being chased by Jezebel. And I think you read from David. David was being chased by his own son from Psalm 63, and he was out in the wilderness, and he was crying out to the goodness of God and telling of the greatness of God as his life's being demanded of him from his own son as he's being chased. So you have these examples. Yet here we find ourselves as Christians just kind of in this routine motion of life, going through one day after the next day, next experience. And I think we're living a less than life. And I think what is the example and the point that I have tried to drill home the last 4 weeks, and the point that I would like to make for each of you again tonight, is this time away, it's like food for your soul. It's just peace. It's resetting. It's refocusing. And theologian John Brown says, Beginning with the Damascus Road encounter, Christ took Paul under his immediate tutoring. Because again, Jesus had already left the scene, but Jesus reappeared to Paul, right? And so scholars would say, again, we don't have a lot of proof of this, but like it appears that when Paul pulled away for 3 years, that he was being directly instructed and administered to by Jesus himself. Because Paul came back with a man on a mission. And he said he didn't acquire any of his information or knowledge from any man's teaching, right? So Jesus directly gave him this ability to teach and lead and be this apostle that was equal to all of the other apostles, yet Paul had never walked with Jesus the way that the other brothers did, right? So it was this special commissioning on Paul's life, and scholars would say, we believe that this time away was vitally important to Paul's ministry and vitally important to the mission of moving the church forward, yet none of us have any silence, solitude, time away. Most of us, I think, we could describe our prayer life as pathetic and weak. We have Hail Mary prayers. I call them, that last minute, hey, I know I deserve an F on the test, but can you give me a C, God? Maybe an A, and then you get an F because you got what you deserved, right? Or you have those prayers at the last minute versus this devoted time where you're pulling away, sitting with God, praying, maybe listening to worship music. You have cleared your schedule. It's important to you to be with God. And I can tell you from my own life that's not often what happens. You go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. We jam-pack our schedules where we have no room for anything else. And in that, we find ourselves completely maxed to the full capabilities of our own abilities. And in that, we're exhausted. In that, we're tired. Am I describing just my life or your life as well? Here's a good quote for you. To find life, we must die to life as we know it. To find meaning, we must die to meaning as we know it. Any significant life change means dying to something we've valued, while embracing what comes ahead. Seeking God away from everything appears to be necessary for the rebirth of Paul. Seeking God away from everything appears to be necessary for this rebirth of Paul. How about you? If Paul had to spend this time away to discover this new rebirth in his life, in this relaunch of this former life to this new life, because what do we say the Christian walk is? A new nature, a new life. And yet many of us struggle to find this new life. We kind of keep one foot in and one foot out, right? We're kind of halfway in, halfway out. Where Paul's model to us is he spent this intentional time away. And what is that for you? Maybe it's an hour a week. Maybe it's an hour a day. Maybe it's 10 minutes. Maybe it's beginning somewhere where you're intentionally devoting your time and your energies and your thought process to say, if Paul needed it, if Jesus, fully God and fully man, needed it for the healing of his soul, he made it a priority. It was something that he did in order to do the impossible, which was go to the cross. Before he went to the cross, he spent time in prayer, and he didn't want to do it. So that shows you that prayer gave him this supernatural ability, right? Here's Psalm 62. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from you. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be always shaken. Trust in him, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. It's this silence before God. It's this honest pouring out of your heart to God that I think gives you freedom, allows you to walk in this newness of life. And I think what's missing in most of our lives is we don't have this silence and solitude and aloneness before God where we pour out our hearts to him. Dietrich Bonhoeffer describes what solitude is. He says, being away from everything looks like this. He calls it a day alone. As meditation prayer and intercession, he calls it. The fruit of that time, the test of meditation, he calls it, is how the person returns out of the solitude back into community. So many of you who are struggling with other people, listen to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived during World War II. He was killed by the Germans. He says, the fruit out of the time, the test of meditation, he calls it, is how the person returns out of solitude in community. Has the time made him free, strong, and mature? Has it lodged the Word of God so securely and deeply in his heart that it holds and fortifies him, impelling him to active love, to obedience, and to good works? And so Dietrich says this time away with God should secure you, should, as David said, solidify your feet and your steps. Your foundation is strong. And then Dietrich says, out of that time away, it should fortify you. It should give you this active love, this obedience, and a drive to do good works. And so if you're here and you're struggling with other people in your lives, perhaps you're struggling with a coworker, perhaps you're struggling with your spouse, perhaps you struggle with me. Perhaps the face of Tom Ginsler irritates you, because I know there are people who think that. I would encourage you to spend time with God, because the result of spending time with God isn't going to be a finger-pointing session of meanness. The time spent with God is going to, I think, bring you to this humble position to where you realize how little you are and how big He is and how in control of everything God is in your life. So here's an application point for you. Aloneness. Have you ever tried to be alone? Have you ever tried 5 or 10 minutes? Maybe solitude and silence have something in them for you. Maybe this time away, just sitting in the presence of the Lord. It's in your house. It could be here in this sanctuary. You can come here anytime and spend time here. You just have to let me know, or I can give you a key and I can let you come spend time here. But to be with God, to take our burdens to the Lord, to, as the psalmist said, to have this open heart that we're pouring out to God, seeking refuge in Him, is vital. It was vital for Paul as he sought this relaunch and rebirth of his life. It was vital for Jesus. It was vital for Elijah. It was vital for Moses and all of these men of God that we would say we aspire to be like. They did it. So turn off your news channels. Turn off YouTube and whatever else is a distraction to you, and spend time with God. And I think in that, as Bonhoeffer said, you will be re-energized. You will have this Christ-like fix and focus on your walk with God. And in that, you will have, I think, tremendous fruit and growth. And God will be glorified through your life.